Muscular rock and roll soul best describes this band, I think. One of the most powerful live acts of the 1970s. I am, of course, talking about Grand Funk Railroad. Grand Funk were a seminal force in 70s rock music, built on fuzzed-out guitars, high-octane performances and funky jams. And let's not forget sheer bludgeoning volume. This band, undoubtedly, in terms of their tones and atmospheres, were lighter than Sabbath, but slightly toothier, I think, than Bad Company. But nevertheless, made a huge impression on the world stage, the live stage. Let's not forget their live album from 1970 was considered one of the best. And this was a power trio, reminiscent of Cream, of course, their contemporaries, as well as the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And this band combined a feral rawness with a melodic sensibility, of course led by the vocal chops of Mark Farner, who was remarkable. The emphasis, of course, was on good time tunage, rocking melodies, with just the occasional whiff of social commentary, especially as a lot of America's young men were being shipped off to Southeast Asia. And their rough, ramshackle sound and working class roots, these three guys from Michigan, they certainly, I think, had an accord with their audience. And this band's biggest break was the Atlanta Pop Festival, where they shared the stage with Led Zeppelin and Janis Joplin, and they were so good they managed to shift themselves up the bill. This was a seismic moment for this band. I interviewed Mark Farner on this channel not so long ago. Let's see what he had to say about it.
The Atlanta Pop Festival was probably the most significant part of our career as far as notoriety and as far as people hearing about us and the demand from those people to hear more of us, because two of us were 20 years old and Mel was 19, and we just a three-piece band from Flint, Michigan. We show up in Atlanta, Georgia. Nobody ever heard of Grand Funk Railroad before, but we got on stage at noon on the 3rd of July, because it was the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. The concert was a 3-day concert. So we get on stage and kick it off with all of the music that was on the first album, Barry. And that music, they got revved up, and we did one cover tune on the end, which was Land of a Thousand Dances, Wilson Pickett style.
Oh, wow.
And I would take off my guitar, throw it to the guitar tech, and just start dancing around the stage and just going crazy like a 20-year-old madman.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the people loved it. We opened the show at 12 noon the first day. We went on at 7 p.m. the second day and 11 p.m. the third day. So we gradually went up to where we had the full lights and everything that a headliner would have had.
And this band were a significant band. I mean, they made 10 great rock albums in less than 10 years. They sold out Madison Square Gardens 2 nights running. Field Baseball Stadium sold out Shea Stadium, 55,000 seats, with people getting tickets by just simply going to the windows and buying them. They weren't available from ticket agencies or any other outlet. In many ways, they often boast that they outstripped the Beatles in that respect. But in that pantheon of hard rock and classic rock, often Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Stones are often mentioned, but this band don't even make a footnote. And there's no doubt that this band's star has faded in the old dusty annals of public consciousness. Let's not forget this was a band that supported Led Zeppelin in 1970, I think it was, and was so damn good as a support act that it infuriated Peter Grant, who threatened the band's manager, Terry Knight, and insisted he remove the band from the stage immediately. Terry Knight, nobody says no to Peter Grant, so Terry Knight got the band off the stage to the boos and hisses of the audience. Of course, the band signed to Capitol in '69 and released their first album On Time. The first single was a track called Time Machine. And despite being a trio, there was nothing emaciated about their sound. In fact, one critic described them as sounding like a rock and roll orchestra. And that incendiary sound was created by Mark Farner, of course, Mel Shacker and Don Brewer. And as was the want in those days, the workload was incredible. They churned out a second album, also in '69, often known as the Red Album. But not only was that a great album that adorns many t-shirts to this day, then came Closer to Home, my personal favourite, and considered, I think Mark Farner has stated that it's his favourite Grand Funk album as well. This was the album that had that 10-minute epic, I'm Your Captain, Closer to Home, which would become Grand Funk's most loved pieces, and certainly embraced by all those young men being shipped off to Vietnam. But this is an album that sees the band step up, I think, in terms of their musicality. Call out has to go to Mel Shacker's wonderful swampy bass lines on tracks like Aimless Lady and Nothing Is the Same. It all adds sonic depth, I think, to the Grand Funk palette. And we get the stirring Get It Together and the graceful I Don't Have to Sing the Blues. But this band's forte was on the live stage with their decibel shredding performances. They certainly represented a kind of rock and roll apocalypse of sound when they did play. And they certainly gained a reputation in terms of sheer bludgeoning force up there with Blue Cheer and the MC5s and bands like that. But unlike those bands, Grand Funk would retain that often elusive element, which was melody. It was an element to their compositions that made permanent tinnitus worthwhile. And the Survival album is an interesting one. Of course, it has the band dressed up as cavemen, hence the idea of survival. What was interesting about that is the covers on there. There was a cover of Dave Mason's Feeling All Right, as well as the Rolling Stones' Gimme Shelter. I mean, these were fairly new songs at the time, and Gimme Shelter is a dark apocalyptic number that certainly suited this band's sound. And their version, paradoxically, although heavier, has a lighter feel to it. And Phoenix is an interesting album. It's a transitional album. Transitional is often used as a euphemism for not as good. Nevertheless, it's a great record. It showed the band were willing to fight on despite an expensive lawsuit with their manager, who they sued, I think, or left. Had to pay him off with virtually everything they had. Hence the image of the phoenix rising from the ashes representing the band. But also saw another seismic shift for this band when they ceased to become a power trio and added Craig Frost to their lineup. Of course, this band were a household name in 1973, dominated the airwaves in the USA. We're an American Band is considered one of the most important and iconic of albums, with that wonderful song written and sung by Don Brewer, of course, and his vocals on that album and a couple of songs he sings on it are just fantastic, I think. It's also produced by Todd Rundgren as well, who would get on board with that, and he would produce their next album, Shining On, which would feature a interesting cover of Carole King's Locomotion. All the Girls Beware, I think the quality of the albums was beginning to drop off, personally, as the band were just probably exhausted, I guess. It did yield the singles Some Kind of Wonderful and Bad Time, but it's the next album, Born to Die, which is darker, and despite a great tour and a live album, the band split up. In '76 they did get back together and were produced by Frank Zappa, and he did a wonderful job on that album. He also contributed some wonderful guitar parts to that record. The album I'm talking about, of course, is Good Singing, Good Playing. But they did release a couple of singles off this record that didn't even bother the charts, I think. Can't You Do It failed to reach the top 40, and the second single, Just Couldn't Wait, didn't even chart at all. They went on to do a couple of albums, I think, without Mel Shacker and Craig Frost. It was just Farner and Brewer. A couple of albums that don't really register at all, really, and usually languish at the bottom of any ranking videos of this band. Until the band, there were various reunion tours until Mark Farner was effectively stiffed. Mark Farner still performs live today, and it's incredible. His voice is still incredible, I think, and I would love to see him if he ever comes over here. It is my opinion that the power, influence and volume that this band exerted in the early 70s, they deserve a prominent place in the narrative that is American rock and roll. And some might argue that they even deserve a footnote on the burgeoning heavy metal scene. They were certainly one of those bands that cranked up the volume to an obscene level. Anyway, it's just my opinion. Anyway, that's a topic for another video, I guess. I'd like to thank you for engaging with this one. If you're still watching without switching off, I want to thank you for doing that. And I'll leave you with my closing sentiments, which is, as you know by now, hope you're well, staying safe, but more importantly that you keep listening.